I'm going to give you some background to the project, the context in which this research was funded and why and what it's all about, and then Michael's going to talk about the results that came out of one of our case study applications. So this project was kind of nice in that sense that Michael and I sort of both got to do the things that we like to do. Michael got to crunch numbers in Stata, and I got to, talk through, policy relevant decision making and the application in that respect. So this work was funded by Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage and the WA Planning Commission. It's a project that's been simmering along in the background for us for the last couple of years, where we were asked to develop valuation instruments that would help in the context of coastal hazard adaptation planning. So coastal hazards in this respect are pretty specifically referring to the impacts of erosion and inundation from sea level rise. So these are becoming major issues, particularly for WA, but Australia-wide and even internationally. So I'm sure most of you have caught the media coverage over the storm season with Port Beach disappearing in front of our eyes. Seemingly in front of our eyes. There are processes that have been causing that to happen slowly over time, of course. And the state government has released information to local governments, who are typically the ones responsible for managing the impacts of coastal hazards. So the stretch of coast that's in their local government area is their responsibility. They've released information about the amount of sea level rise that they're expecting those governments are going to have to deal with over the next sort of 100 years or so. So these are quite significant issues, particularly for our local governments who don't have huge budgets to try and think about how they manage them. In terms of community values, obviously coastal hazards are going to have an impact on built infrastructure, both public and private, so that's an issue. But also they're going to affect the values that people have for those non-market public assets, whether that's things like your surf life-saving clubs and cafes and things that people access on the coast, or the actual natural environment itself. So those things are important to people, and as they are slowly eroded or inundated, that's going to have an impact on them. Importantly, these values are going to affect different stakeholders, so obviously the local communities and the user groups, but some of those things like the natural ecosystems, cultural heritage and other stuff is going to actually have a wider reach. So we know well that existence and non-use values can affect people who might live hundreds of kilometres away from the coast. Importantly, community values are not just impacted by the hazard events themselves, but also the adaptation responses that managers might put in place to deal with those. So a good example is, for example, if you've got a beach eroding away, you could implement a beach nourishment program, which is where they take sand from one place and put it in another to reconstruct the beach after each storm season. Obviously that's an ongoing effort, it can be expensive, but it sort of keeps, I guess, the usability of that beach relatively intact. Another option could be to put a seawall in. Now that one's going to end up being a bit more divisive because you've got this hard infrastructure in place that's going to do a really good job of protecting what's behind the seawall, but whatever's in front of it, particularly your nice sandy recreating spaces on the beach, are going to be lost. So some people will benefit from that and others won't. Seawalls themselves have quite expensive capital costs up front, they have maintenance costs and they have a finite lifespan. So there are a whole suite of these different types of management responses, all with different costs and benefits, and managers are grappling with which are the right ones to put in place. So while it's obvious to us that different people are going to be affected differently depending on what you do, it was recognised by Department of Planning when they started to think through this process that they don't have a good grasp on this. So the local governments, when they tend to consult their communities, often use those sort of community forum type discussion group approaches, which means they tend to get a good understanding, an in-depth understanding of some subsets of their community, what they really care about, but they're not getting that representative view and they're not understanding how different management responses will affect the wider community. So that was an area that the Department of Planning saw a need to improve. Case in point, a few years ago in Seabird, which is just north of the metro area in the Shire of Gin, they constructed a seawall which cost $2 million to protect about 15 houses along that little stretch of coast. So it's a local beach in Seabird. I think, at least I've heard, of those 15 homes that most of them are not even permanently resided in. Some of them are holiday homes. And then they made a decision to extend that seawall to also protect a car park and a boat ramp. So obviously the homeowners benefit from that, and it's very easy for them to quantify that benefit because it's the value of their home. The people who are launching their boats there benefit, but the rest of the community probably weren't particularly happy about that approach, and also about the expense because they're having to fork out for that effectively through their rate payments. So this was a really good example where Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage saw the need to actually bring in this more representative, quantitative approach to identifying consumer values so that local governments can make better decisions rather than just going with what seems like an easy, logical approach at the time. So the Department of Planning released its CHRMAP guidelines, which are, CHRMAP stands for Coastal Hazard Risk Management and Adaptation Planning, which is a stepwise process for local governments to go through and look at the risks and vulnerability of their coastal assets and how they might then respond and manage that for erosion and inundation. So basically they do a whole lot of mapping to work out where those risk lines are, which bits of coast are they likely to lose to erosion or sea level rise over every 10 or 20 year period. Within the CHRMAP process, there are a number of places where community values are relevant. So first of all, they need to identify which assets might be at risk. And from a social perspective, we then need to ask the question, do people care about those assets? Because if they don't, maybe it doesn't matter that they're at risk. They might matter for other reasons, environmental or commercial reasons, but we need to get that social perspective too. In terms of evaluating the risk to those assets, we need to understand people's tolerance for that. I mentioned that in terms of the erosion and inundation, these are things that have been happening slowly over time. We're seeing it become more visible now, but the processes have been happening for a while. So the impacts are actually quite incremental. We're often not losing a whole beach overnight in a storm. We're usually seeing a slow degradation of that space, or sea level rise is obviously happening over time. So we need to understand at what point is it when we start to have these marginal changes, at what point do people sort of say, yeah, no, I don't accept that anymore. I'll take this much loss of my beach, but not this much. And then in terms of the adaptation approaches, we obviously need to understand which outcomes people care about the most so that we can implement the adaptation response that's going to manage best for that. Interestingly, Department of Planning have a hierarchy for adaptation in terms of the order they would prefer local governments to follow. First of all, they prefer that you avoid building in a place where you're going to have water soon, obviously. Secondly, they prefer that you have a managed retreat response. So that is where you move people back and away. That one's pretty contentious socially, as you would expect. Thirdly, they would prefer that you design to accommodate. So obviously you can build and construct things so that they can withstand the impacts of storms, erosion and so on. And lastly, they suggest that you protect. So that's interesting because I would guess from a community perspective that their hierarchy would be flipped the other way around, that they would prefer you protect what you already have and try not to avoid and retreat. So that's just an interesting perspective. So with that in mind, the Department of Planning came across some work that we've been doing in the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, developing the value tool, which is a repository, a database of non-market values to be used in benefit transfer for decisions around natural hazards. That database is very focused on things like bushfire and flood as opposed to coastal hazards. So the material that's in there wasn't really very useful for them. And so instead they decided to commission us to go and do some work and think through different methods to develop instruments, survey instruments or whatever it might be, so that when local governments are coming to the points in their CHRMAP process where they need to engage the community and assess their values, that they actually have a tool, something they can pick up and consistently apply. So we worked through a set of criteria with the department on this. One was that it needed to be accessible to those coastal managers. They're not going to have a lot of time and resources or extensive skill sets, so it needed to be quite user-friendly. and it needed to be something that could be consistently applied. A big problem for the department is that each local government goes out and does its own thing. So although they're collecting good information in most cases, it's not in the least bit comparable between different areas along the coast. And that's a problem because we could probably learn a lot if one local government has done something and assessed something, and we can transfer that knowledge elsewhere. But when everything's so inconsistent, we can't make very good inferences from that. Obviously, the non-market values were important to consider in this space. We wanted to be able to measure values for multiple assets simultaneously. So when a beach area is eroded, we obviously have some impacts on the beach, but we also might lose some of the infrastructure at that beach. We might have grass reserves and things like that that start to be degraded. So there's a whole set of things that are impacted all at once. And given that different adaptation responses might protect some of those things and not others, we needed to understand which of those values were most important. I've already mentioned that incremental changes are obviously key, so we needed an approach that could capture values in terms of marginal values. We needed something that was quantitative, so the department wanted something that was ready to feed into other decision support processes like benefit cost analyses, and something that could capture samples of people that would be representative of the populations that we were considering. And obviously we ended up with an economic measure, surprise, surprise. But the idea there being that if we were going to try and meet all of those other criteria, we might as well also put things in a monetised metric so that we can feed them directly into benefit cost analysis. We did work through that process as objectively as we could. We thought about a whole suite of different methods, including non-economic methods, to try and meet those criteria. But not surprisingly, we ended up at the choice experiment end of things because of its ability to put things in dollar values, to measure non-use values, to measure it for multiple assets at the same time, and to do that in an incremental way. Acknowledging that sometimes choice experiments are time-consuming and costly to implement, and given that it was easy enough to do it within the same survey instrument, we also included some travel cost questions as well. So we went through a pretty extensive process of consultation to develop those instruments. It was really important to us that the instruments were useful and usable for the coastal managers. So we worked with the Coastal Management Advisory Group that the Department of Planning coordinates, who include representatives from local governments, from WELGA, from Department of Transport and others. We had focus groups, both with members of the coastal community and Perth Metro more broadly. We sent the final survey draft out to some other non-market valuation practitioners for feedback. So Marriott was one of those people, and Bethany Cooper, I think, might have also provided feedback. So we tried to make sure that this was as robust as possible. And then we produced a guidance report and a set of survey templates. So within the templates, we've basically got a choice experiment survey and extensive guidance about how you then manipulate and adapt that to your specific coastal location. Within that, there's all the guidance around the experimental design that underlies the choice scenarios. So everything is set there, structured, ready for people to just put basically their own words on top of it. We also conducted a pilot test, which was just to demonstrate what information is provided by a choice experiment and how you might then use that information. So the idea underlying this is that we wanted to minimise costs for the coastal managers who would be using these tools. So we tried to get these templates to a point that all they really need is technical input. So it's the understanding of the environment, that risk mapping, which the governments are already doing through their CHRMAP processes. So they have all that information in-house. They know where those lines are on the maps, which assets are likely to be impacted, and what sorts of impacts they're looking at over the mid to long-term future. So the idea is they can update those templates themselves. There's all information in that guidance report about how they can sample and collect data, so they can get to the point of having a full data set without having to engage an economist or someone else. Once they get to that point, they're probably not going to have the skill set in-house to then go and analyse that information, so they probably need to engage a consultant from that point onwards. But what we hope we've done is take something that was probably a $100,000 or $200,000 exercise and bring it down to something that's $10,000 or $20,000 for them, and that type of budget is within reach for local governments. So the survey templates contain all the usual stuff that you would see in a choice experiment survey. We ask about their beach uses and experience and the travel cost questions. There's a set of attribute descriptions that are generic attributes. I'll come back to that. The choice scenarios, and as I said, all of that guidance around how to construct those in terms of experimental design are there, and your socio-demos. The big part for adapting those survey templates is obviously getting the attribute descriptions right. That needs to be particular to your location. So we literally went through a whole lot of colour coding, yellow highlighted bits, words you must replace that are specific to your location, and then there's a whole lot of other guidance about things that are optional and what you might replace it with. So it's literally stepped through where they need to change things. The attributes that we included, this was an interesting process, because if you've done choice experiments before, you know that they need to be quite specific in terms of defining the valuation context. So we needed to do that, but we also needed something that was generically adaptable, something that can be applied for a beach in the Perth metro area that might be a local beach or an iconic beach, something that can be applied in Margaret River or Broome or somewhere else. So we needed to go through a process where we looked at what the local governments wanted information about, what the community thought was really important, and what was common across most coastal locations. So if someone's going to implement this, they're going to have most of these attributes in play. So we ended up with attributes that reflected values for the percentage area of the sandy beach that's protected, the area of foreshore reserve, which captures your sort of man-made reserve spaces, your grassed areas, play equipment, barbecues and all that sort of stuff. The natural reserve area, which is inclusive of your terrestrial dune vegetation and your nearshore marine ecosystems. Beach accessibility, so this one's defined as a categorical variable as to poor, average or good condition, but within the survey instrument you define explicitly what you mean by that. So for one location it might be about how far the car park is to the water, and you would say, you know, a distance of 10 metres is good, a distance of 50 metres is poor, or something like that. It might be about distance between access points along the stretch of coast, or whatever you need to define that as. And then for your sort of public built facilities as to whether they are present or absent, so that might be your surf lifesaving clubs, your cafes and other things that people want to use when they're at the beach. And obviously a cost attribute, there was advice around how you would structure that. If it's a local beach and you're targeting a local sample, you might use your rates payments as the mechanism. If it's a beach that's visited by people from across the Perth metro or something like that, it might be a state-based fund. So as I said, we've had a pilot test application of this, which was on Cottesloe Beach with a small sample. That was just to demonstrate the mechanics of how the survey worked. We manufactured all of the attribute levels in that, so don't ever use that for decision making. So after doing that, the department came back to us and said that they would really like to see this go through to a full implementation. Let's see how this actually works in practice and take this template that we've designed that's supposed to be generic and apply it somewhere else and see if that's actually true. So we worked with the City of Wanneroo on this to testbed the instruments. They were in the middle of their CHRMAP process, so it was good timing for them to be able to illustrate whether we could adapt that survey, and also to provide some information that is actually, you know, quite sound and robust and can be used in decision making. So the City of Wanneroo we worked with in particular because through their CHRMAP, the initial recommendations that have come out of that suggested that a choice experiment would be a really good idea. So one of the recommendations from that process was to engage with the community about the results of the CHRMAP and to assess their willingness to contribute funding towards coastal management. And also to undertake a detailed economic assessment on the value of natural assets in the area. So that sort of just lined up really nicely with what a choice experiment can provide in terms of the data input. And I think now I'm going to hand over to Michael because he likes his pie charts.
So we should say that possibly, what's the name of our coordinator at the top?
Vivian?
No.
Oops, stuck.
Chat.
Sorry, Sam.
Sam. So we have a sort of suspicion, because in those recommendations, it does look beautifully as if they're basically setting up to say, will somebody please come and do some valuation work for us? And we sort of think that possibly he might have been influential in trying to drop that in, or, I mean, or no, you think that was genuine?
Came from Cardno, so Cardno is the consulting company who did that report. So I don't
So this was genuine, unprompted. Okay, even. But it's sort of really quite nice in the sense that explicitly in there, they're always saying, hey, we want to talk about community values, we want to find out what they're willing to pay to support this. So it's almost like saying, please do a choice experiment for us. So what I'm going to start off with is just looking at, as part of that, the Cottesloe project of doing the CHRMAP, they did do some community engagement. That's part of the normal process. And so what I was going to do is just sort of run through what came out of that from their process in order to compare it with what sort of was coming out of ours. So I've pulled up some of their results from their community consultation, and essentially these are Likert. They ask a series of questions and some Likert scales and look at the answers. You've got 122 people coming in to talk to them about it, or to, I think it was an online email. So this is sort of looks a bit like, what do they think is important? Well, beach and foreshore areas are always accessible. The dark blue and the yellow are the strongly support, somewhat support and strongly support. So you can see they definitely think the beaches in that area is important. That's not surprising, but you're getting that strength of support in that area. Private property, we should be protecting private property from erosion and inundation, even if this results in the loss of beach and foreshore area. Well, despite the fact there was this huge support for getting access to beaches, we're still getting some people in here saying they strongly support or somewhat support that idea that we should actually be protecting the built infrastructure of private property, which is slightly in conflict with the idea that we should always have access to beaches, because those two things may not actually be mutually consistent with each other. If assets are removed, so private property, this is like the managed retreat, who should be paying for that? So if private property has to be taken back out to allow the coast, the beach, to sort of just extend in, who should benefit from it? The people who should benefit are the people who are on the beaches, presumably. They should be paying, so that's like a beneficiary pays type thing coming up. Oh, I went the wrong way. If private developments are being protected, so that's like the seabird, put a seawall on, who should actually pay for those? Well, that should be the houses who are there should, be paying for that. So you're getting what you might expect to see is that if these unconstrained choices and you're asking people to make evaluations, then, well, one, how do you trade these things off? Now we've got all these Likerts, but also the degree of inconsistency inside there. So that's sort of what the standard community engagement sort of process would look like before us. So what can we bring to the table? So these are the sets of attributes that we had in the template, and they had to be, I was going to do that. We had to change some of those in the context, because there wasn't actually any of that foreshore reserve existing. I'm going to go back in a minute to show you what the setup is, but there's something called the Yanchep Lagoon, which I'm going to talk about, and it was about terrestrial nature reserves on the coast as well, in terms of what we're going to do. So basically we could map most of what the attributes were that we had in the template. Could be, when we looked at the particular context and talked to them, we could actually look to see what it is, and absolutely nobody talked about surfing. Just to anticipate the comment, nobody said we needed to protect our surf breaks. So just to explain, this is very badly organised. I should have done this better than this. But just to talk a bit about what the lagoon is, because that turns out to be really important. Come on, up you come. Where on this machine is the full screen? There's full screen. So this is the CHRMAP that they have produced for the area that we're interested in and we're supposed to be focusing on. You can see that basically what the CHRMAP does is it puts lines of vulnerability over time, so 2030 up to 2120, and those are the different coloured lines that are going up across here, and that's basically what their prediction as to what might be affected at those time horizons. So you can see it basically just marches in, and you can see that at the longest time horizon, we're starting to take out some private property here. It's getting into the road system in here. There is some clubs. I think in there, I think there's a surf. Not a map, but there's some sort of infrastructure. And which potentially could be at threat, so that's what they're worried about. And then there's this thing called the lagoon, so there is a reef which sits in here, which then generates this protected area here, which is obviously great for people with kids. So this is seen as being sort of a really distinctive feature of the beach and access, and something which potentially, with sea level rise, would disappear, as in the lagoon would no longer provide the protection. So there's lots of interesting questions about, well, would you be happy then? You could just you could put some limestone on top of that and just build the reef up as the sea rise goes up, and you maintain the protection, but you don't have a natural system. So this is the context where the things that we're interested in, this is what they are interested in understanding what we're going to protect, and the lagoon bit, which we're going to talk about and see turning up, is this little nice, beautiful protected area in here, which is under threat from the sea rise. So where was I? I was back down here. There, okay. So this is the nature of what we've done in terms of a standard choice set. It's the area of Sandy Beach, it's the lagoon, deteriorated, maintained, and we described what that meant in the previous, as in the terrestrial reserve, beach access. There's various access points. We could describe what was going to happen, and then we described actually what those facilities were, whether they were going to be present or absent. What was going to happen, there's a question about time frame for these, because you need to, it's obviously not going to happen tomorrow. They know something about the time process, but we also have to put this into a time frame where people are actually going to be able to process this. So the top one, 2120, that's what, 100 years. Is anybody, if we present this as a 100-year time horizon, would anybody meaningfully willing to pay to protect something that happened 100 years? So we just framed everything within a relatively short time horizon. But you need to think about that when we think about the values as to when the impact actually would happen. We probably accelerated the impact in our hypotheticals. Each person saw 5 of those, 25 in the full design. Normal setup. Where do we get our people from? Well, there was an interest in trying to broaden this out to beyond the normal suspects who are going to respond to City of Wanneroo questionnaires and forums. So we went for a panel. So we pushed our panel provider to give us, I think, probably just about everybody they had, if they could, within the City of Wanneroo and the surrounding LGAs, because we wanted to get the locals, but we wanted to get them sort of sampled rather than just them volunteering in. We also asked them then to pick up the rest of Perth. So these groups are relevant because potentially they're going to have to be paying for this. The Seabird one was a state-funded outcome, not just local. So the question is, we wanted to see what the rest of Perth might think about this. There were some nice comments coming in on the survey, things like, what, you think that we should be paying for this, from people who didn't live near, saying, well, why are you even asking us this question to pay for Wanneroo's beach correction? So obviously you could see that that's turning up. And they also wanted us just to go through their mailing list, but hardly any came in. We'd lose 44 for people who were protesting. They always chose the status quo and did the follow-up. So the first question we want to do in terms of the stats is, does location matter? We've got these 3 different samples potentially where people are. So those who are in the City of Wanneroo, those who are in the surrounding LGAs, those who are Perth Metro. Does where they live matter in terms of the way we estimate their preferences? Formal test? No, as in it doesn't matter, surprisingly to us. It didn't matter where you lived in terms of how you responded. They were responding consistently to our choice sets. But then we also asked information about whether they had visited the beach, so were they familiar and actually participated in it, because if you'd have thought that if you were actually going to be visiting it, then you were actually, those are the people going to care about, potentially going to be caring more about the degradation of it. In the sample, we've got 161 who are visitors, 236 who are non-visitors, who in the last 12 months haven't been to the beach. We could do a formal test to see whether or not we can combine those 2 samples together. The answer is no. Those 2 different groups definitely have different preferences. We had a bit of extra information, sort of standard follow-up questions. One was we asked them, did you take into account the cost that we're presenting to you? And some people said no. So 115 actually said, no, cost wasn't important. So that's like an attribute non-attendance. Basically, there's some people who are answering this and say, I ignored the cost attribute. And whether they're a conservation group, we thought that might have an impact. There's a very small group of those, but it does turn out to be important. So what do we get out of this? So we're splitting the samples into two, visitors, non-visitors, to see what the impacts are. This is for the visitor sample, and you can see that they have, well, let's go to the important things. Cost, those who attend to cost, coefficient is negative and significant, yay. Those who say they didn't attend to cost, it's negative, but it's not significant. Another yay. Essentially, they were truth-telling when they said, I didn't bother about looking at the cost attribute. They actually genuinely seem to not be bothering to look at the cost attribute, which is an issue for us in terms of, well, what do we think about their willingness to pay, but at least their choices in the responses to the choice sets are consistent. And then what are they actually interested in? Well, they're interested in, the visitors are just interested in Sandy Beach and the lagoon. So obviously their criteria for wanting protection is purely based upon, essentially, that looks as if it's based upon their use values. So there's a very particular set of values, and it's about visitation, not about being local. And then this is the non-visitor sample, and perhaps surprisingly, I don't know which way I go on this. Am I surprised or not? Anyway, let's see whether you're surprised. Okay, I don't know. So cost, again, negative for those who attended to cost. The not attending to cost, well, it's 10%, but we're getting that consistency. But these guys actually seem to be valuing much more in the system, as in they are valuing beach area. They want the lagoon maintained, but they're also interested in the protection of the terrestrial reserve if you're a member of a conservation group. And these guys who are not visitors are actually seen to be putting values on access and facilities. So they seem to be taking this bigger perspective as to, well, if we're going to protect this stuff, what do we want? We want potentially to protect a broad suite of things. So these look as if they're operating more as community-minded people who are thinking about what should be protected rather than, I want the stuff that I particularly want to go and look at. This was a HET model. The other one wasn't, but we had some things which are affecting the error variance, which is about how difficult did they find the survey and did they think the survey was going to be useful, and they just moved in the right ways in terms of changing error variance. Willingness to pay estimates. So we can just do that, but we can do this for subsets. We can only do this for those who say they attended to cost, because that only makes sense, and for the terrestrial reserve, it's only for the people who are members of an environmental group because they were the only ones who valued it. But what you can see is we're getting reasonable consistency between the visitors and non-visitors about how you value a percentage increase in beach. The lagoon, you can see, is massively valued in terms of when you can put it into willingness to pay, and particularly for the visitors, 253. That this has been set up as being household per year for 10 years. This was a 10-year investment program. So at least in terms of the way they're representing it here, this is a massive commitment to wanting to keep the lagoon, indicating that that's some sort of, looks like an iconic feature that they're just absolutely committing to. The non-visitors, not so much. And then for the non-visitors, these sort of about $42, that's for attributes like beach access and whether you've got the facilities there.
But there's a lot more non-visitors. Once you scale up to the population.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So those values, which I think I didn't put in, yes. As in if you include the Perth Metro people, even and the visitation rate for the overall sample, they're the ones who basically would drive an aggregate value. We also did the travel cost component was in there as well, which we sort of did include. We said, well, you could do this. You could do it very simply. You could just put somebody down on the beach and start collecting this data, and you would get some information about, in terms of asking them about number of trips they've made and so on to the beach. You could quite quickly and easily get some values for the value of trips onto the beach, and so you could do that, but the only problem is you're only getting the value of visitors to the beach. So it's a simple approach, but you're getting a much smaller set of of values are being picked up. We've been doing this, whenever we've been doing this, we've asked them about trips in the summer months and the winter months. We expect that to be different. And what pops out of this is an estimate of, for the summer model, it's about $6 per trip, a day, a trip to the beach. When you're going in the winter, it's about $4. Probably not significantly different. I can't remember whether that was formally tested. It probably would have been, because it would have not made the difference. But we're getting, and those numbers are actually looking quite consistent compared to the other ones that we've been doing elsewhere. When we did the Cottesloe one, and when we did he whose name has disappeared, Alexei, our French intern, who did lots of stuff up and down the coast, estimating this type of stuff. Okay, so where are we at? How useful is this? This was like a case study to try to get this implemented by a real sort of end user. City of Wanneroo are still looking at it in terms of working out what they want to do with it, but those dollar values are available if they want to put it in, evaluate some impact. We don't know how much take-up we're getting. They haven't been quick in coming back and asking us questions, but we'll see. It did seem, so this was, as in the setup for this really was Department of Transport saying, we've got this instrument, we'd actually now like to see it, rather than just putting it out there and say, go do it, we actually want to see a pilot run of this to see whether it can be picked up and used and run. And we sort of took a bit of a hands-off on this. Vandana was employed as part of the project, and we basically just, although she's not obviously skilled, she's not somebody who's never seen this before, but basically we just said, okay, go and try to implement this and to set up the survey in this context. So she was having interaction with the city, working out what the attributes should be and so on. So we sort of did, it wasn't like really handing it over to the City of Wanneroo and say, go do it, guys, but we were one step back from that. And it seemed to work. And hopefully, we're going to start building up. If people do start doing this, we're going to start building up a set of values that for these different attributes in different places up and down the coast, so that if enough of them get going, then we don't necessarily have to keep on doing and do everything, as in that some cities may just say, oh, we're similar enough to Wanneroo, the numbers seem to be quite consistent, we're going to transfer it. The travel cost numbers for the value per trip is around about $5. Looks to be quite consistent across lots of studies. You'd almost say you don't need to bother to do that anymore. It's about $5 a trip. If you want to think about what the loss is, if you know how many trips you've got to your beach, and you know you're going to lose your beach, you could probably just pick up $5 a trip, and you've got a number to identify what the loss is going to be for the users of the beach if you lost it. Yeah, so there will be some variation, but it seems to be the Cottesloe ones, which Alexei did, were reasonably in the ballpark. But I mean, if you said, give me a number for the value of a trip to a beach along the Perth Metro, I would say $5, not 50.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you lose one beach.
Okay. In terms of cumulative, okay, yes, that's big. That's in the context of what you've got currently available as the substitutes. Yeah, but we're going to protect them all anyway. We're going to beat silt water. So hopefully, to building that up, so we've got we can add to, if like, the benefit transfer set of attribute database. This one is available to you if you want to dig it up and have a look through it. And somehow we've managed to go for 40 minutes. Thank you.